similar developer patterns I've used. And it's one of the things I've been lacking, I found in the Node server, was just the structure in general. But if you're new to programming, you wouldn't know any, but like you wouldn't know the difference. But when you start coding a lot, there's a lot of you just inherently get into structures and patterns as you work, and get you start to get used to things, right? How you think they should be. And one of the things I found with Node was like there's just too much. You can do whatever you want, basically, right? Whereas a pattern like this, which is similar to Angular, it enforces a certain pattern on you. And one of the great things it has is it has a CLI that helps you generate out things quickly, but you scaffold out into their pattern, and it helps you scale when you organize things really well, as opposed to like a 5-10,000 line main entry file, which is totally unmaintainable as you grow. This nice little framework, it helps you out for sure. So similar to Express, with another type of flavor. Like I said, it reminds me of Angular just because I have done it before. But anyhow, talk about the architecture a little bit. I mentioned Angular a little bit, but I won't dive too much into it. It's basically a Node.js framework, server-side for server-side applications, which is nice. They have their logo's a cat. I guess the Nest.js cat. I would probably say better than Mongoose, which is a mongoose. So it's meant for server side. The cool thing about it is now when you install it, now this might be, like I said, this is not required for your project and not required for your lab test, because maybe some new people have learned JavaScript, right? And that's fine. You continue with Express. When you install Nest, it actually supports TypeScript. So now you're going to be coding, and that might be the challenge in TypeScript, right? The lab will show you the step-by-step, and you may not feel comfortable in TypeScript. But if you're coming from a coding background, you'll really welcome TypeScript because it takes care of a lot of the structure problems that JavaScript has, right? When you define something as an integer, you want it to be an integer. You don't want it to actually change on you all the time. So it actually really enforces types strong. So it reminds me of like C#, right? In fact, I think it's owned by Microsoft, right? And then as you're building out this architecture, it actually helps with the testing and all of that. Everything's pretty loosely coupled. It is heavily inspired by Angular. This is the actual website, and as you can see, like there's I didn't realize there was dev tools, but it's meant to be progressive, versatile, extensible. I guess I like the fact I have the cat there. But the syntax is different. It has a good documentation too. Like I'm impressed. Much better than Express, and much better than Node. It's actually quite nice, and there's a lot to it. And one of the things is the CLI. Like I mentioned, it reminds me of some of those other CLIs that we used before. So the main things is they wanted to address these challenges that we had, and I always felt that way. I always thought eventually the community, I guess, would figure this out, but this is a way of enforcing structure. Had a lack of structure, but this helps you organize things now. Scalability concerns of Node because of lack of structure, so this actually helps with scalability. TypeScript support. Node doesn't natively support it, but they actually help with that. And it just when you start out, now maybe for a small application you don't need this, but when you're building a big enterprise app, this kind of structure greatly helps a dev team or a company build out apps, right? Similar to how you've been working with React. React itself has an architecture and structure. Can you imagine doing your apps in pure vanilla JavaScript? Can you imagine doing that? You would not have any structure to it. It would just be files files and patterns that, or no patterns. It would be, it's hard to maintain and hard to make changes, lots of bugs, lots of interesting problems, right? Because there's no framework there. As I mentioned, TypeScript support. So TypeScript looks like this in a nutshell. When you have a constructor, now when you pass in a name value, you need to actually explicitly say it's a string. And if there's an ID, you have to explicitly say it's a number. And if you don't, I mean, there is a concept called any, which means it can be anything. But at compile time, it makes sure all the types are successful and run correctly. But if anything happens where you pass in an object instead of a number, it's going to break right away. So it actually really enforces this typing, right? And readability as well, I guess, if you are into programming, like you understand that, what these things are, because in JavaScript you don't know, because it's dynamically typed at runtime. You don't know what it is. Like you have no idea what XYZ variable is until you debug, right? You have no idea. Just 1 second here. 1 second. Hold on. Sorry, I just interrupted there for a second, but back. So anyhow, if we look at this TypeScript site in itself, right? There's actually like a playground you can run coding in, and it has very good documentation as well, right? And basically for JavaScript programmers. Some walkthroughs on defining types. There's a concept now of interfaces, which if you're a coder, you understand what that means. Even when you do objects, right? Here's a simple object, but now you're saying it's of type. So it's one downside to TypeScript is it's not as like JavaScript's very run and gun. You can just run and go. You can say I have a user object and I don't need to define what it is, right? It's a user object. So what? It's a user object that has key value pairs. Now, the extra step with TypeScript, just to get background, is if you're going to say that this is an object, it needs to have a type. So if you're going to say it's a user type, you need to define an interface called user, right? And then you could say I have a user object that has name value pair that's string and number. So already you can already see like, maybe that's too much for me, right? But in the beginner tutorial, we won't get too deeply in TypeScript. I'm just explaining, the differences here a little bit, right? Everything is strongly typed. Even in your functions, you need to say, what they are. Even in React, if you use TypeScript on the React side, you got to like, it'll have a concept of like, if you try to assign a variable to JSX, it's going to want to know what it is. There's actually a type called JSX element, and you need to define it, right? Your methods need to return back a void or like a promise. You need to define it also. It's like extra steps, but it's a lot of headache sometimes defining these types. But I find after a while, it's quite good in terms of like helping you. But again, it helps more. I mean, it all depends. Like there's two camps. People love this and people hate it. It's really like, especially the Java school purists, they don't like TypeScript. And then there's the other guys that do love it. So it's always a interesting battle. But anyhow, this comes along for the ride when you install Nest. So that's one thing. And then it has a modular architecture is one of the main things that it's really kind of got going for it. It encourages a modular approach. So everything is a module, right? So the idea is to make your application smaller and more manageable, but it has these things called controllers, services, and components. Controllers, services, and components. Controllers, services, and modules. Should that be modules, perhaps? I think that should be modules. Controller, service, and modules. I have a typo there. So you can see here there's a controller for books. So we had a router in Express, but they have a controller That's number one, right? But when you see the controller, it actually, when you get used to it, it's pretty nice. Anyhow, the service would be like your custom module. So every time there's a service, the service is where your custom logic goes, right? The controller is what deals with the APIs. And then the module just puts it all together. The module just says, okay, this is my controller, and this is the provider, which is our service, right? And it bundles it all together into like a little modular piece that is the books, and you can plug that in or not plug it in. It's basically like a unit of code that has all these things built in, and you can either use it or not, just like React components. If it's not needed, you don't need you could create a library of these, and most of them might not be used, depending on the implementation, but you would have them there and their own self-contained unit that could run code against and be upgraded and very separate. So it's actually it's called loosely coupled, as opposed to like a very big kind of tightly coupled, 5,000 line code piece, right? So again, modules. So if you can visualize this, we have the Nest.js module, but now we have a books module. It does whatever books needs to do, the logic. It has a user module, and then you can keep stacking these modules, right? Maybe you have a transfer module, a transaction module, I have an address module, I have a wallet module, all these different things that I don't know what the implementation is, but I know I can plug them in. And then in my main app, I just plug them in, right? I import them. So it helps you really organize your application and gives a nice structure to your app. And like I said, on Node, back end, this is like sorely missed. And it's like I'm very welcoming to this kind of thing. The readability, and then obviously maintainability for smaller modules, and you can test them and swap them out, right? Think about a production app. Like I said, you might have a tax module, and you need to plug in, last year's one needs to go away, and this year's one needs to plug in because the interest rate now is 8% instead of 2.5%, and everything that goes along with that can be plugged into your app. Instead of handcrafting and trying to manually go in those big long code pages and trying to like manually, configure the routes and change the logic, right? Break a bunch of stuff. Angular had this architecture here. You can see on the front end, they had more than React had. That's why I said Angular was a framework. It had all this stuff. It had modules. It had components, right? Like React components. Concept of provider and piping and guards, something like that. Like it has more than that, but it comes all together, right? Whereas React is just a component library. And then we add on. So Nest similar has some of these similar. They have module, controller, and provider. So I had a mistake there. It wasn't component, it was controller. So module, controller, provider. And they have something called piping and guards, which we won't get into. But it's server-side. So they took a nice pattern and brought it server-side, just like Node.js copied the web architecture for event-driven applications and made it in the back end. So they did that. So when you install your Nest server, you're going to install the Nest.js CLI, so command line interface. So much like we had create React app, this actually takes it a step further, like create React app would scaffold out a whole application for you and then run it. This CLI will allow you, it'll do the same thing. So you can do Nest new my Nest app, and it'll scaffold out a Nest application like this. So you'll see there's a bunch of in the source, there's an so the app, so the main.ts, first of all, number one is it's TS. So that means TypeScript by default. It's all configured for you. The TS config is basically configuration for the server for TypeScript. Out of the box, it does that for us. The main entry point is main.ts, and then it has the app, like the app.js, but it has an app controller, an app module, an app service. It all configured for you. And then they have the testing already built there. just to scaffold out a structure for you. And then you can build on top of that, right? You can plug things into the main app module, and you can build out your other controllers. Now, one thing you might say, there's a lot of files, but it's a pattern, and you don't manually have to add these files. If you use a CLI, it'll generate out all these files for you. Like if you know how to learn the CLI, it'll actually create the controllers and everything, and it'll actually automatically do the imports and everything nicely. So it's quite nice. Let's look at our code quickly here for a second. Not that one. That one's for JavaScript. This one was Nest.js. So we ran this guy here, and you can see here, I did already do a little bit of work here, but if we look at the TS config, this is basically just configuring for TypeScript. Package.json, it sets it up for us. So all these different dependencies for Nest, testing types, all the types for TypeScript are all configured here. TypeScript types has ESLint and all these different things already configured for you. It does configuration for Jest in there, as well as common core things. Next common core. It also has RxJS, which is reactive programming that's built in. That's pretty nice. And then it configures differently, right? So if you do npm run start, it's going to internally run Nest start. You can do npm run dev start dev, which will like nodemon kick off a watcher to allow you to do hot reloading, and a bunch of other things in here for other kind of testing things. This was the lab. You can see a test folder. I didn't add to that. It has just on the server side, interestingly left, for end-to-end tests, which is interesting. I haven't explored that, but I built out my own I built out the lab where I have a module for books, and you can see book controller, book module, book service. The main.ts is the entry point. Again, you might not, this does the bootstrapping, it kicks it off. So all it does is just kick off everything, and it loads this app module. You don't have to really worry about this too much. The app module is here. Again, I've built it a little bit more, but the module imports the app controller, which I don't think does anything aside from hello world. So it does just hello world, and has a very basic service. And then I plugged in, because I did the lab. This is the lab. I plugged in that books module, and then you import it. So it's taking modules and plugging them in essence. One thing that right away is a little different is it has this concept called decorators. And I mentioned it in Angular, where they had like a decorator for input and output. So it kind of comes from ES6. It's basically a way of wrapping a piece of code and giving it, a wrapper functionality around it without altering it. So if you wrap a piece of code as a Nest decorator, like controller, injectable, module, pipe, request response, these kind of things, basically your underlying functionality is still in place, but you're wrapping additional functionality around it. Just by adding the decorator, the framework will wrap it for you. So it's a nice way of giving a method, or you have a JavaScript service. You create a service, right? Like something that is as basic as a logging service. But I want to use that logging service everywhere. I want Nest to be able to use it everywhere. But the old way of doing it was like going in and requiring it everywhere using Node. I have to require it everywhere. I have to and it's a lot of pain to do that sometimes throughout your application. If you mark it with an injectable decorator, then you can actually import it for the whole context of the app, right? So the framework will know what to do with it if you add that decorator. So it's basically taking your JavaScript coding and functionality and things like that, and basically wrapping it in Nest functionality. So the basic concept of a controller is the controller handles the HTTP requests, much like the router does for Express. If I run my CLI, I don't have to do that configuration steps that I showed you with the router, where you have to manually kind of add middleware and kind of set your route and export it. You can sometimes you can misspell something or not export it properly and it doesn't work, right? So here it'll actually just, when you run the CLIs, it'll create it for you. Now you have to do a bit of configuration, but when you get the pattern out, it's really nice. So you can think the different types of controllers you could have for like books, transfer addresses, all these things. There'll be an address controller, a book controller, transfer controller, and it's responsible for everything involved, such as data storage and retrieval and logic, whatever else you need. But the pattern is that all that logic is not inside the controller. All that logic is in the service. So the pattern is kind of like controller and service. And then once you bundle all that up, then you stick it inside of a module as a container. So it's a bit much, but once you get the pattern, it's actually quite nice. So you can see here we have controller from Nest.js common, and we have a get, which is just a decorator. So all we're doing here, and this is our main app controller here, is we're decorating our method get hello, which is a string, because that's what TypeScript lets us say, that the return is going to be a string. It's just a normal TypeScript method, but when we decorate the get, it basically does the equivalent of what Express would do when you need to say app.get, right? This is going to handle all GET requests now at the root level, right? So there's a decorator for post, a decorator for get, a decorator for delete, and a decorator for all those verbs will have decorators. So a little bit less typing to get what you need. You just put that decorator on any function and automatically it hooks it up inside of it'll add it to the route table, if that makes sense. In the same ways. So it's actually quite nice, right? It's like Spring Boot. Okay, I'm not. I imagine this pattern is very similar, right? Like, I mean, it reminds me of Angular, but if it's like, I know Java and Spring Boot has this common pattern as well. So if you're used to this pattern, this is the idea: is to give this kind of structure to developers out there, right? And that's the idea. Let me see here. All right, so let me quickly go to this app here. So you can see here I have the module and I have this controller, and this is the same thing on the controller level. It has the get decorator and it just says hello world, and this is the app, the basic app. So if I run this guy here, where's my terminal here? Open a terminal window. And what was it again? npm run start. I want to kick off the watcher dev. So where am I here? npm run start. npm nest start. I guess my watcher, I spelled it wrong. So nest is kicked off and running. I want to say it's on port 3000. I forget, to be honest. So on port 3000, if I hit the entry point, okay, so it's not. Let me inspect it. Let's see here. Oh, it kicked off. Okay, it took a while to kick off there. You can see. Thank you, Nest. It actually did a nice. It does tell me port 4000. Thank God. Thankfully, it told me what port. So port 4000. Hello world. So at the bare minimum, it served me up, that on that root level, hello world, just in case somebody hits the main site here. We're building out APIs, but at least we're saying this is the root level. We can include some information there, but it's the app level, which is the root level, and it's hitting get, right? That would be the equivalent as if, someone came in and just hit the /route. And it doesn't matter what this method is, but because it's configured by default, it's going to be the get. I could also then add like a post if I wanted to post here. I don't know what this is going to be. I have to include post from my comment here. Post. I have a decorator. I don't know what this would be. Just whatever. Say goodbye, right? And that would be a string. And then I would return. Oh, okay. app service.get. Okay. So I could do that, and it's basically kind of have some, so you can see here there's a little bit of issues with prettier, but that's just the browser. So you can see here, you can see here that whatever is being returned is hidden away from me. The idea is the controller, just like the React component sometimes renders, the controller is just handling the requests, and then the service would have whatever logic it needs to. So inside of here, this is a service. It's marked with injectable. That means something. But if I wanted to add to this, so I have my service that gets injected, I would say goodbye. So much like our React modules, custom modules, return goodbye world, right? Kind of grim. But, and you can see prettier is just basically barking at me, but I don't like that. And this might not pick up because I don't have my watcher running, but this shouldn't break anything. And then inside of my, you can see there, it's just causing me grief with the lining, but that doesn't break anything. The idea is when I hit this endpoint for post, say goodbye should be called. I might need to kick off my watcher here, CLS. Under package.json was npm run start dev, npm run start dev. It should kick off the watcher. Okay, so watch is happening. So that if I go back to Postman, where's Postman here? Post on 4000 on the root level, right? Goodbye world. So I just added an endpoint, and I added it so quickly. It's just a decorator, right? I just added the decorator. So this is the logic was inside the service and inside of my controller. There's a way to turn off this prettier thing, by the way. I just on the fly here, it's bothering me, but there's a way here somewhere. Where is it again? Quick fix, disable prettier for this entire file. There you go. So when you disable it, it adds this little ESLint thing on the top, and then it gets rid of those squiggly lines that it's basically linting to tell me that it doesn't like what I'm doing, based on the rules of linting, which I can configure, by the way. So that services, we kind of get the idea of it. It does the logic. It just further separates things out. You mark it with this thing called injectable. It's a decorator that basically allows it to be provided to a controller or somewhere in the app. This concept is called dependency injection. It's one of the solid principles of programming. There's a whole programming pillars of not only object-oriented programming, but of software design. But the point is you can take some logic, and instead of always instancing it, like creating an instance of it, like, okay, I want, logger service. So logger equals new service. Okay, I have to do that everywhere. What this does is it allows you just to inject it anywhere you want, right? So it's a way of just injecting it and having it be available. So it's a really good concept, but it's basically comes in the box, so you don't have to really worry about all that theory. But it basically allows you to define something that can be reused everywhere. So if you think of React like the context API, that you basically allow the whole context to have access to it. Here it basically allows us to be injected anywhere in your app that you might need it or you don't need it. If you don't need it, you just don't use it. And then you can, when you have something that's injectable, that's a piece of code that can be used anywhere, you can test it. The unit test in isolation, right? If it's a logger, I can run tests against it. It works. I know it works. So if it gets injected somewhere, it'll always work, right? As opposed to having logging baked in everywhere, it could be implemented differently everywhere. So it's very loose. That's the idea, is like it can be used anywhere, ideally. So here's a logger service. It just logs on this right here. It has the decorator for injectable. That's all it is. It just logs the message, a console log. But you do that so many times, right? You don't want to keep doing that. So if you want to, oh, sorry, it got cut off there. I can see, but you can't really see it. I mean, you can. I got to fix that slide though. I don't know if I can fix it here. Can I? Oh, I can. Okay, let me send that to the back. There you go. So you can see here, logger service is coming in, and in my app controller, it's because it has this decorator. When you define it in the constructor, it automatically will inject it. That's it. It'll automatically resolve it because it has this decorator. It knows what to do with it. So you just say, I want to use it, and when the app controller fires up, this will be ready for you to use anywhere. And that pattern will be everywhere. Any object that has a constructor, if you define it, it'll automatically resolve what it is, and it'll be available to you right away to use. So it's really useful once you get used to it. It basically provides functionality everywhere. So that hello world method or the logger will now be available anywhere that I might want to use it. Or say, how are we for time? Okay, Q2. We're almost there. The other main concept now is modules. So we always have a application module, and that's like the root module. That's a starting point. And then you have these other modules that plug in. So you may have users, orders, chats, but then you can also plug in other modules. You know, if you have an orders that need like, you know, invoicing, different kind of things, you could plug modules into them and thus into the root module. So it really breaks apart logic. And if you have an invoice module that you use for orders, you could use that same invoice module for accounting if you wanted to in the future. So it kind of forces this structure. But you can see, you know, when you start really using this on a big app, it's very in the long run, it saves a lot of time when you build something really big. And the module is the container. So the module is like the thing that sets everything up. So it says, okay, I have a controller, I have a service. In my module, these are the lists. It's an array. These are all the lists of my controllers. These are all the lists of my services. And then it basically wraps it all up in a container. And then you can plug it into the main root. This, in fact, is the root module, but anything that else would be added as a module would be plugged in as an import. So if we go back to our app module here, you can see the books module has been pulled in and it's now imported into this whole thing. So it has its own definition, and then the result of that is plugged in here. So as we grow, you know, all the other modules will then be plugged in, and we have a nice kind of like a nice way of organizing everything. And the main entry point, of course, is just this is the bootstrapper, which the bootstrapper, you don't need to really go in here too much. It just says it's much like the create React root or the React render DOM or create root. That entry point that grabs the main root element and just like renders all the React information into that entry point. This is the entry point for our Node application. And of course, the CLI. When you install this out, I'm running the watcher now. I'm running the build. These are the things where it gets really cool. Is you can say, okay, Nest generate a module, cats. It'll go and build you the module. Next, generate out controller, cats. Generate a service, cats. It'll build those files for you, and then it'll nicely set it all up for you into a cats folder, and then everything will be kind of, as you're adding these things, right? You add the module first, then you add the controller, it'll actually import it for you. Then you add the service, it'll import it into the module as well. So it starts to help you scaffold out things a lot nicely. Is there anything else? No, that's it. Obviously, there's more to it than that. But in the lab today, in today's lab, we do look at that, and okay, it's not there. It should be part of our, hold on here, and not this one. I will just go to my download folder somewhere because I know I have it, and it's the building a simple lab with Nest. Let me expand this out. So it'll walk through how to install the Nest CLI globally, how to scaffold out this Books API. Then you'll have this initial setup that we went. You have the app controller module and service. It's configured for TypeScript, and generate the books module. So that'll generate the books module, which will create a folder with a module there. It says create a books controller, so you can actually run the generator, Nest generate controller books, or you can manually add it. Doesn't matter, but the generator does it for you. Because we're dealing with TypeScript, we have to build a little class. So we build a little class called book. It has the different properties of the object that are defined. And then you can also do npm generate book service, or you could create the file itself, but you need to do books.service.ts to match it all up. Make it an injectable. And this is exactly, if you look at the lab where we did with Express with books, I think we did, this is the equivalent in Nest.js, right? It does the exact same thing in terms of retrieving all books and also pushing into the list. It just does it in a different way. So you can contrast it. The controller looks like this. So now it's like we are adding a getting the controller from CommonJS. So Nest.js Common, we're using the get, the post, the body, and we're just decorating the get and the post. So that will give us, if you notice here, if you can just mute your microphone, please, because I'm almost done. And let's see here. So the one thing to note here is when I give it a controller decorator and I give it books, it automatically will set that route up for me now. I don't need to do anything else. So now anything coming in on /books, it'll know that this controller deals with that route. Beautiful. And then I add decorator for get and post. Automatically, it knows that anything that's on a post for books goes here. Anything on the get for books goes here. And then the service deals with the logic. You could have, to test it out, console log get, console log post. One other thing to note here is some dependency injection happening there. So the service is automatically inserted, so you don't have to do anything else. The service, book service, is available to you right there under this object. So that's dependency injection at work, probably because the book service has a injectable decorator. And I guess the other thing is the body decorator here. So you can see here, if you decorate this book, you decorate the payload, the request payload on the post will automatically be serialized. And if you give it the format that you want it to be serialized in, it'll automatically parse it apart for you. So it's a lot of magic happening here. But it's pretty powerful. Like there's a lot happening here, as opposed to Express Router where you had to really kind of code everything, right? So right away that is serialized and it's ready to push, right? That book is the entity interface that you set up here. So, and then that's it. You configure the mob. So in the main app module, you plug in the book module, and it basically says it's ready to go. So once you plug it in, now /books is ready to go, and you kick off Nest start, and you test your API out, much like we did, right? So let me quickly try that, and it's up and running here. So I think we had books endpoint. So if I do a get request on books /books. So you can see right away I did the get request. It's giving me back 1 because I think in my my code I have some test data that I added in there. So if I want to post, and I'll set the JSON data. So I'm going to set this to, I'll set the ID to 2, and this is book number 2, book 2, and test user 2, send. It said created to 2001. I guess basically it's giving me a green check mark. If I go back, swap back to the GET request. So I have 2 now. So I know it's working. My API endpoint is up and running. Just a little bit of magic there and what it's doing. So if I go to my books module, you can see here I have so I have a couple things going on. So that's the entity there. That's just my that's my definition of what my payload I want it to be. I have my controller here. So it's basically just setting up those routes, right? So it says there's a post route, and it doesn't matter what this name is. It really doesn't matter. Basically, as long as I define it as books, those verbs will be fired. Now, I'm sure you could then go ahead, and if you wanted to add like slash, details here and details here, this would then update the URL to be /books/details, right? So we could change that on the fly, and our routes will pick it up. Should pick it up. Let's try it. So /books/details. So it's actually firing, right? So go back to post. So I want to post on this, and I'm going to say book 3, book 3, book 3, right? And post that. It says okay. Go back to my get. So now I have 3 elements there, or actually it looks like it overwrote one. To be honest, somehow I guess my code in the background isn't actually pushing properly. But anyhow, like I quickly just modified my routes on the fly so I could build those out, right? So anything you put inside of the get will be part of the path. This is the main entry point here. And the only thing is, and the other thing to note is the body of the payload gets mapped to that interface that we said it would be for TypeScript. It returns a void here. This one returns a book of an array of books. And I put in console logging because I wanted to see my endpoints get hit. That's why I did that. Almost there. Create book, same thing. I just put the console log so I could see these endpoints being hit. But then everything is abstracted away to the book service. I don't know what it's doing. The service, you can see here has like some static data. All it does is return the static data. This one pushes one into the static data. That's it. There's probably something there where I'm missing something. That's why it overwrote the last one. But anyhow, I have my controller, I have my service. Everything gets wired up in this books module. So you can see here they're imported. And then basically we're saying that, I mean, there could be more controllers, but for this module, we have one controller, one service. It gets bundled up in a module as a container. It gets exported to the world or to our app. And then in our root module here, we basically plug it in. But if we don't want to use it anymore, we just basically, Nest will say, okay, we don't have that anymore. I took it away. Now, if I go back to my Postman and I hit it, it's going to basically say that is no longer found anymore. Why? Because I unplugged it. Pretty nice, actually. I didn't have to comment out code. I didn't really have to modify much code. If this was Express with the router and all that, I'd have to do more. Here, I just unplugged it, and then it's offline now. So you can imagine as you're building these routes up, you could unplug them and then they'll no longer be accessible or have like a redirection or whatever. It's quite powerful. So really only one lab today. There wasn't an intermediate or beginner. It's just getting started with Nest. And like I said, it's your choice which one you want to use, whether you want to use Express or this one. Give this one a try. You may like it, you might not. It's your choice. Whenever you do the lab test or you do the project. If you did Nest, it's like a feather in your cap, but it's not required. It's optional. And that's it. I put up the submission for today's lab. Should be up there somewhere in our teams. I can't see it right now. And I'll stop recording. And we're